down here with the winds. As Rachel was saying, my name's Dave Sausville. I work with Vermont's Fish and Wildlife Department, and we're going to talk a little bit about the benefits of wetland conservation and restoration on public lands, primarily wildlife management areas that I deal with within the department. And I'm coming at this from a water quality and people and wildlife perspective of what we see as wetland restorations and conservations benefiting. So just to start out, just to remind everybody what our mission is within our own department, is we're looking at trying to conserve all the species of fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats that are needed within the state for the people of Vermont, and obviously the wildlife that are out there. When I'm talking wildlife, I always talk in a broad way. You know, fish should be part of wildlife, but we're talking about everything from mussels to moose, and we kind of look at it that way. And just to kind of remind everybody what we're trying to conserve, as I mentioned earlier, we're working with natural communities, we're working with habitats that are throughout the state. It can be fish, anything from a trout to a small sculpin. We're looking at plants, you know, we could have pitcher plants and bogs, and then also a lot of what people don't think about are the invertebrates and insects that are out there. And then, you know, obviously people think about the megafauna such as black bears and moose, but you know, I always like to look at it, you know, like I said, we're looking at it from moose to maples all the way through, trying to work with all the habitats and the communities that are out there. And then those that we're serving, you know, a lot of people have been misled and think that all we serve as the Fish and Wildlife Department is the hunting and angling public. And really what we're working with all Vermonters. So it could be landowners, technical assistance on the habitat of their property, or whether they're having an issue with a human wildlife conflict and try to mitigate that. And we work down through to wildlife watchers, from bird watchers, you know, to people that enjoy looking at mammals. And really what I'm looking at is trying to work with communities and keeping those habitats and improving them for the future generations so that we have something to pass on. So just a little bit of the history of our department. We really started working with wetland conservation back in 1920 with the first acquisition of WMA Wildlife Management Area with Sandbar up in the Milton area. And that was the first piece of state property purchased for wildlife habitat east of the Mississippi. We had a few national wildlife refuges out there, but if you think about it, the 1920s was before the Dust Bowl era and before we had plummeting populations of migratory birds and a lot of intensive land use. So we were actually a progressive state back then before we knew it. And, you know, the next period was kind of in the 1950s and 60s. We had a lot of people coming back from the Second World War. They used the GI Bill to become trained and educated within the colleges. And we had an emphasis with new biologists and equipment and personnel on the Dead Creek Wildlife Management Area down in Addison and the Cornwall Swamp portions, and with acquisitions and actually creations and restorations of wetlands on those sites. And a little bit of the areas that we have also within our fisheries division was stream banks and parcels that they were purchased for access for anglers along streams and along private lands. And then also in the mid 80s, we had a fund that was developed with the Vermont Duck Stamp Fund. 1985, it was authorized, and the first stamps were sold in 1986 for $5 a piece, and that was required of any waterfowl hunter in the state, and it's given us some monies to work with. It was increased to $750. That was a nice little pot of money that was allowed. And throughout those times, we've also used, especially in the 1990s to present, what we call knocker grants, North American Wetland Conservation Act grants. Those are funds that come from the federal level and are competitive and usually at $1 million basis. And that came about because of the what they call NAWAMP, the North American Waterfowl Plan. And that when you have a plan, obviously you have to have money to conserve the habitats that the species need. So that's been a very good process for us and our partners to use. And then up until 2015, we began the habitat stamp. And then just recently, in 2019, we have the EPA grant that we'll be touching on here that is administered through DEC and the Lake Champlain Basin program. And that was, as the title suggests, is accelerating wetlands and the conservation of those within the Lake Champlain Basin. So over the last 100 years, Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department has gone from 1 wildlife management area to 101 now. About 150 60,000 acres statewide, and of which about 30,000 acres is in significant wetland habitats. I just want to touch base on how we manage these lands too, and just the various funding sources we've used on state lands. Pittman-Robertson is a fund that is created at the federal level, a tax on hunting equipment and things such as firearms and ammunition. We have the license fees that we charge within our department. As I mentioned, the duck stamp fund. We work with a lot of NGOs and have matching funds for various grants that we go after. We could be working on grants for endangered species. Again, the Habitat Stamp Fund and also the EPA funds that are out there. Just to give you a little history, as I mentioned earlier on the Duck Stamp Fund. So since 1985, we've raised about $5.1 million within that fund. And what's very advantage for us on that is that that fund is dedicated just to wetlands acquisition and or enhancement. And we have a citizen advisory board that helps us with project reviews on that. It's actually we're very envied by many of the states up and down the Atlantic Flyway that we work with, because that is dedicated money. Many of those states have to use their funds and spend them right away, or they'll lose them to other projects. So the way it was set up originally, this fund, we have interest that's created on the principal each year. It's been ranging the last couple of years at 200 to 300,000. And we do not spend that principal, so we only spend the interest in it. And it has helped us to do 99 projects over the decades and about 13,000 acres of land. I'm just putting this map up there to kind of show you the distribution of where the projects have occurred. And obviously it looks like a high concentration in the Champlain Valley for good reason, with our wetlands that are in that area. And also the focus of on originally for waterfowl production areas and brood rearing areas that were going to be accessible for the public to use for hunting, bird watchings, and things like that. So I know this is a busy slide, but there's a lot more information we could have put in there, and I wanted to just show the main points of the EPA wetland funds that we're working with DEC and the Basin program on. But the original outputs were, our goal is for 3 to 5 wetland acquisitions per grant cycle. And we're looking at a minimum of 40% restoration on those projects and restoring 100 acres of hydrologically. Within that, there's some leeway. You know, each project isn't going to be a 40% restoration. We agreed upon that within our committee. Some projects will be less, and we'll make up with it on other projects in those areas. But overall, we're looking at a minimum of 40%. So some of the values that are out there, you know, improving the values and functions of the wetlands that are existing. We're looking at improving degraded wetland areas. Obviously, we're looking at surface water retention and nutrient removal, stormwater filtration, you know, all of those that we espouse throughout other presentations, and just looking at, you know, attenuating floodwaters and bringing that all together with creating better wildlife habitat and also access for people for recreation. And one of the things that we're looking at also is increasing what is available on the landscape level. If you think about it, we have these patchworks of state land with wildlife management areas, state forests. We also have town forests, the national forest that is out there. If we can use these funds to create connected travel corridors or expand on those patches of habitat that we have, that's what we're looking at doing, while at the same time improving the water quality, reducing floods effects on the public, providing public access, and increasing recreational opportunities. And within the time frame of this grant, it started in October of 2019, and right now we're looking at going out to 2023, and we have 5.2 million available. And if the next grant cycle comes through, a total of about $7.2 million will be available to put on the ground for restoration and acquisition processes. And just some of the accomplishments to date that we wanted to share. We have 9 projects that have closed or in the process of closing and at various stages of restoration. They're scattered up and down the Champlain Valley. Last I looked, we have definitely 7 of those projects that have closed and 2 that are right at the last stages where the landowners are signing the paperwork. So we're really happy about that. Of that, we've been allowed to acquire just over 2,000 acres of land and over 1,300 of those acres have been restorable. And they're all in different phases of restoration work. Really, this is the first spring since we began, and we're starting to do some work on them with exotic plant control and working through getting permits. But as you can see, we've set aside, or should say expended, $2.9 million, almost $3 million of the EPA funds for acquisition. And partners have also brought in another $1.2 million, partners such as Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, the Nature Conservancy, DU, and others. And we've also estimated at this point that we need about $500,000 of that to be spent on the restoration work. That will obviously increase as we acquire more properties, and we'll keep working to update those as we go along. Just kind of giving you a process of how we were doing what we did with this EPA grant is, first off, we had to find the landowners that were interested in selling the property. It's always voluntary. And with that, we've developed focus areas, and we sent out what we called cold call letters. We knew individuals that were interested in locations, found the addresses, sent letters directly to them. We also talked to our partners about who they had that might be interested in selling properties or doing wetland restorations on them. Then we also just looked at real estate listings and have those monitored and pop up within certain areas. So as we found a parcel that we were interested in, we do a desktop review by our wetland steering committee that's made up of folks from DEC wetlands section. We have fisheries and wildlife biologists on there, and we'll give it an initial thumbs up to move ahead with it. And so at the same time that we're approaching the landowners, working through purchase and sales agreements and surveys, we're also working up a restoration plan and taking elevations to see what we can do on the property to restore it. As we have those plans available, we bring them to what we call our district stewardship team, and the state's broken up into 5 different districts. And on that team, you have, again, fisheries and wildlife biologists, recreational specialists, foresters, water basin planners, and asking them to take a look at it, see if they see any red flags, any other suggestions of what we could do with the restoration. And then we talk and agree upon what's going to happen in the long term. Once that's all worked its way through, obviously we have to go through permits just like everybody else. So, the first one that we'll go through would be an archaeological review with our state's historic preservation office, contact some other of the local tribes down at the Massachusetts border, work through Army Corps permits and all of our internal permits. And then after we get approval, usually we're working through all this, we're looking at a year and a half at the minimum. We get into the implementation where we break ground to restore the wetlands or do plantings. And one of the things that we really have to remember is we always want to have that follow-up. So even after we've done the restoration, we want to follow up, make sure our structures are still in place, that the vegetation is responding the way we want it to, and whether we need to do any alterations for exotic plant control or reestablishing plants in a different way. As I mentioned, we have focus areas established, and one of our criteria internally was we were trying to focus around existing wildlife management areas to add to them, or as I mentioned earlier, create corridors to go from one block of habitat to another. And that's not saying that we're just going to do this work on wildlife management areas or near them. We're willing to create new wildlife areas if the parcel is big enough. We're willing to work with people such as state or town forest lands, even national forest lands. But the caveat on that is the land that we're working with and that it is adjacent to has to be permanently protected, and that we're not going to lose the adjacent area and just have this little small island of habitat out there. We want to have as big of an effect as we can. And just people think of town forests as being protected, but many of them are not and can be sold by the town to create revenue. So that's just one thing to think about when we're out there. But some of the examples of our wildlife management areas, out of the 101, we have 22 that are significant with wetlands. Up in Alburg, Mud Creek is an example, easily accessible by the public. Rock River and Highgate, Lamoille River down in the Colchester, Milton area. And then we have areas that are down throughout the Otter Creek River Valley that are very significant with wetlands. And we are, as we mentioned, as part of conservation and restoration, I want to make sure everybody, really thinks about the difference in that. When we're talking about wetland conservation, we're talking about acquiring existing wetlands, maybe buffering them more, protecting them from encroachment of land clearing for agriculture or urbanization. And we have a host of those projects that we've done. Whereas restoration, we're actually going in there and trying to restore what we think used to be there from historic records and what we think we can actually restore because of limitations on either ownership or what the land looks like at the current point. So some example of these conservation projects, and most of these were purchased with, at the time, North American Wetlands Conservation Act money or duck stamp funds, but they range from examples of Half Moon Cove right here in the upper corner of the slide, and that up in the Colchester area. And if anybody has been there, you know it's a beautiful oxbow wetland along the Winooski, but urbanization is right up to its edges, and we wanted to protect that so it didn't continue over the side. Lower Otter Creek in Ferrisburg, many beautiful wild rice marshes, buttonbush wetlands that are out there along the Otter Creek River, and then areas up in the Northeast Kingdom, such as the Clyde River. So those are our conservation efforts to provide access and public use of the area. And just some of the little more up close ones looking at up in the South Bay Marshes, up in Coventry in the Northeast Kingdom. We have beautiful wild rice here in the foreground, cattail marshes in the background. We're having everything from birds feed on the rice seed that's available in the fall. Cattail areas are used by muskrats to provide food and housing for themselves. And then we have that beautiful, what we call hemi marsh up there, trying to get that 50-50 mixture of open water to cattails or other forms of vegetation so that, ducks can use the area, wading birds. These are great spawning areas for fish. Going down to the southwest end of the state, so we're going diagonal right across the state, is Keswick Swamp down in the Sunderland area, Arlington, Bennington, down in Bennington County. Completely different type of wetland. It's a forested wetland, almost a bedding, but you'll have different species using these areas, and you also have the aesthetics of the fall colors and people enjoying the canoeing and boating on these areas. I visited this site and I've seen river otter feeding on fish that they've captured and had moose through the area, and is also one of the most southern areas of a heron rookery that we know of. Another conservation type of program that we have within the department is our beaver baffle or beaver management program. Our fur bearer biologist, Kim Royer, originally helped set this up. And what we're looking at doing here is working with towns, landowners that have beavers plugging up culverts, affecting roadways, maybe affecting a timber stand that somebody wants to harvest, or even just affecting people's septic systems and backing it up. Well, these devices were able to still maintain the wetland, but at a lower level, and keep the water down where people will be acceptable. It's usually a conflict of people with the natural environment and the wildlife that are out there more than it is wildlife, because they're in their home sites. So with this, we can lower the water level, maintain that wetland primarily to start off with for the beaver, but all other associated animals, maybe it's mink, maybe it's kingbirds that have a nesting area nearby and are feeding over the site, fish species that are in the site, and we maintain that wetland habitat with a very small dollar amount, and also help the public with their issues. To go along with that, we have the same idea as fencing out culverts. What we're doing here is just cleaning out the beaver debris out of culverts, allowing the beavers to build back up around the fence, and then when the little flush of spring runoff or floodwaters come, it bounces up over the beaver portion along the fence and drains out through the culvert and still maintains the roads. Very simple and effective methods, but with all of these, and even on some of the wildlife restoration or wetland restoration areas, people have to remember that there's always a maintenance. So you're always going to want it to be going back and checking on these activities. Going into more of traditional wetland restoration, and what people think about when we talk about wetland restoration is, if you look down here in the lower part of the slide, you can see an aerial view of the fields, and all these lines within those ag fields are lateral ditches that have been put into the landscape to help drain it, make it more efficient for farming, more productive. So this is a location down on the Dead Creek Wildlife Management Area in Addison. Was at the time, about 20 years ago, our Partners for Fish and Wildlife program with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service could actually spend time and money on state lands. And we worked with them to survey the site, get elevations, look at what we have the possibility of doing without influencing other people's land. And then once we had a design, we brought in the heavy equipment, started moving soil to plug the ditches that were there. And on this, we actually put in water control structures to keep it up from flooding onto the neighbor's property. But as you can see down in the lower picture, once we had that in there, just the natural rainfall, we created the wetland areas. It actually expanded much further back where my cursor is to the east. And we have a very large wetland area, and that one is right in front of our viewing area. So we benefited the wildlife. Basically, it's a field of dreams effect. You build it, the wildlife shows up. You have geese, ducks, wading birds, shorebirds in here, and at the same time we have those. We have eagles and peregrines show up that are hunting those birds that are attracted to it. So and that being right in front of the viewing area, the Dead Creek Wildlife Area, we had two birds with one stone, as they say, because we had the wildlife habitat restored, and we also had the public recreation of watching these birds on the refuge site. Another example of a wetland restoration that we did in a little bit different circumstances is down in Brandon Swamp, kind of in the Lester Junction area of Otter Creek. For those of you that know it, you can see this ditch coming right through the middle of the field. What you can't see basically behind the photographer is we're within 50 to 100 feet of Otter Creek. And on this backside, that's private land into the forest. And so we approached the neighboring landowner to see if they would be interested in allowing us to flood their forested wetland. And they were not opposed to it, but they didn't want to sign any legal documents that would allow us to put water back onto their land. So we had to kind of switch gears a little bit there. And what we did was we ended up putting a water control structure in there after taking shots on the elevational shots on the site. And I set the level a foot below the property boundary to make sure that we wouldn't hold water back when the flood waters had receded. So as you can see here, the contractor's down in the ditch, putting the structure in there for us, and we'll be able to restore and gain as much wetland habitat back as possible at the time without flooding onto the neighbor's land. Here's the structure almost completed. You can see in the background where the trees are, that's the Otter Creek. And what we did here is we made very gentle slopes on both sides of this structure. So the water goes in through the pipe, it flows through water control structures where we have boards in there to control the water level at the level we desire. And we made 7-to-1 slopes. So for every foot I came up in height with the ditch plug, I had to run it out a distance of 7 feet so that it basically acts as what they call as a submerged spillway. As the floodwaters come up out of the river, they gently flow over the top of the ditch plug, and then the waters recede, they go back over it, and we're trying to eliminate any erosion problems here. So once we completed this project, we seeded it heavily to put erosion control material down on it, and then I've actually walked back over this past spring of 2020, and it's still there and in good shape, and some trees are starting to grow along the buffer in the area. So as I said, it's not exactly what we'd want to do all the time. We wanted to just plug the ditch and walk away, but in this case, we got as much as we could with the wetland restoration. With that project, we also have to think about what we want to do with the areas, because those the land that I showed you in that picture was being farmed prior to one of my predecessors that was down there was John Gobel, who's up in our Essex office now. He removed the farming activity, and we started to establish a forested buffer along the creek. So we did some plantings, and within these tubes, we used some wildlife habitat improvement money from NRCS on this. We planted ash, maples, oaks, and a variety of some alders are in here. And we really didn't want to use these tubes, but it was required by the practice with the funds that we had, because I was worried about ice scour coming down through and taking them out, putting them in the river. But actually, the floods and the staking didn't take them out. So we have some nice 4- and 6-inch diameter trees that are growing down there now. And the one thing you will encounter along the riverways is that now the beavers are coming in and feeding on the trees, which is a food source for them, which doesn't matter to us as a restoration standpoint, because those root systems are stump sprouting and putting up multiple stems, and we're going to have that woody material down there. Some other, some other activities that we have done, this is an example, anybody that knows the Mallett's Creek Wildlife Management Area in Colchester. It's on a parcel that's called the Gold Parcel. And we had some ditches going through there. So what we did is we just simply plugged the ditches and we created some shallow water areas. You know, I call them potholes because they remind me of the prairie pothole region where I worked when I first started out of the university. And we also shaped them as oxbows or other formations that you often see on floodplains that are scoured out. This is beneficial to waterfowl because of the shallow water feeding areas for puddle ducks. We also, if you go in there, you'll see numerous types of salamanders and frogs. And when you walk, even a year after the project has been there, you'll see tracks from raccoons and mink and deer and other species that are using the site. So they come into it very quickly. The native vegetation will come back on to the site. This site, we're actually going to be doing some additional work because if you look to the left side, all that grass is reed canary grass. And anybody that's worked with it knows that it takes a long time before native vegetation comes back into there. So we'll be looking at doing some mowing on these sites, probably spraying, and then also doing some hydro seeding of seed sources, along with some direct plantings. One thing I did forget to mention is in the background, you can see those snags that are sticking up. There are no trees on this area and no larger trees. So we actually dug holes and put large woody debris upright, hoping that maybe an osprey will come in and nest on that. And then as the forest develops, the trees will replace that structure. An example of a project that's a little bit further along. This is one that's down on Dead Creek. And in the foreground is a ditch plug that we put on there. And we also had to put a water control structure on this site because what you don't see on the left-hand side of the picture is about 250, 300 feet in that direction is a fence line that is private land. They're farming for corn, and there's a ditch coming right off of that land onto the state land. So what we did here is captured and plugged a location that captured 2 ditches. You can see the water is very murky and sediment filled. That's coming off of that row crop that was fall tilled and left uncovered. So this wetland is acting, you know, as a sink to capture silt, capturing that nutrients that's there. As it opens up in the springtime, about this time of year, there's a lot of invertebrates starting to grow, and those insects are very valuable to waterfowl species coming through. They're going to feed on them. The insects have a high protein content, and their exoskeleton is a source of calcium and helps with the egg development within the hens. This area also, after it's going to dry out during the summertime, hopefully the fall rains come back on a normal year, and this is going to fill up with water again. Have all that vegetation that's growing there, your smartweed and other plants, bitins, things like that. And that seed source will be a nice source of food in the fall for birds migrating south and onto the area to fatten up so they could head down into the Chesapeake and further. So just touching on some of the water quality benefits, we've mentioned some of them already. Nutrient removal and transforming them. The phytoplanktons that are there are using the inorganic materials to create food. The sediment removal happens with the establishment of trees and grasses and shrubs. It slows that water down, the sediment adheres to it. The plants uptake nutrients and help take that out of the waterway. And it also keeps that sediment from going downstream and affecting fisheries habitat. If you have a nice gravel area downstream and there's some eggs being laid in it by a fish species and you have a silt layer go over the top of it, we could kill that and lose that year crop of fish. Carbon sequestration, we all talk about that now with the climate change. And as we're planting trees and they're establishing their roots and the main stem are holding a lot of carbon back. And simple ones with, you know, groundwater recharge or holding the water there, letting it seep into the ground, and also discharge or allowing it to go at a slower rate. And then at the same time, we've got bacteria that are consuming and using up organic compounds that are in the area. The wetlands are removing toxins and pesticides that can settle out and hopefully don't enter into our food supply or the food supply of our wildlife. Think about the bioaccumulation in some of our fish and the different levels of contaminants. And then as they become higher in levels of mercury and other chemicals, it affects the fish, or excuse me, it affects the people that catch them and eat them. It affects the birds that use them, such as our osprey and eagles that are in the area. It's all connected. And then again, some of the wildlife benefits. These wetland areas are, as we know, are very highly productive areas. Things such as freshwater shrimp, all the insects that are out there, the mussel species, and just what wildlife needs. You know, we all hear about it. They need food, they need shelter. So all those trees that we're looking at reestablishing, the cattails, even the water itself for fish, that's all shelter. Everybody needs clean water to survive. And one thing people don't think about is you need space and refuging areas. One of the big things that happens out there is, and you've seen it more now with the people getting out and about with the pandemic, is wildlife needs spaces to form those pair bonds for breeding and rearing their young. And with all of us out there in disturbance of the different methods of whether we're hiking, we're bird watching, we're hunting, we're all disturbing those creatures, and it causes them to use energy, and it disturbs the young, sometimes sets them up for higher rates of predation, and also effects of all of our dogs that are off leash and wandering throughout the areas while young are out there and just in direct mortalities. So, and just showing some of the benefits of these wetlands, both naturally drawing down like it did last year with our dry season, and also areas that we have control of that we draw them down. We create mud flats. Late in the summer, you have these mud flats and the shorebirds are moving through. Those are great areas for them to be feeding on invertebrates. You'll have wading birds such as great blue herons and great egrets feeding on the minnows and the amphibians that are still there. And you can see in this picture, you know, have waterfowl sifting along, feeding on insects and seeds that they can find. And what we're hoping to have happen here is we want that vegetation to grow. We've exposed that soil, get some oxygen to it, the nutrients start to be used up. And what we're trying to create is almost a moist soil management area. There's a picture here where when it's reflooded with the rainfall in the falls, it's amazing what shows up. This is just a small portion of the waterfowl that are using that area. Some areas that I've been in, I've gone out and watched them in the morning after they've been reflooded, and you can have anywhere from 500 to 600 birds dropping on you at one time. And that's a great experience for anybody that's interested in recreation and having that many birds. It sounds like it's raining and thundering on you as they're coming in. So it's a neat experience. Other animals that use these areas, and I didn't have any good pictures of natural cavities, but until we established a forest and have older trees where limbs are starting to break off, or having some rot in there to create cavities, is what we found in some of our nesting structures like wood duck boxes, osprey poles that we put out, and other structures as screech owls, gray squirrels, raccoons, not exactly the target species we want in there because he's probably stealing the eggs of the birds that we were targeting, but it is a form of wildlife. And then on the bottom, you know, flying squirrels. We're providing different types of habitat, and all that will develop over the years. And you know, obviously we're looking at decades of this, so we may put in some artificial nesting structures just to move some of that along. I just threw this up there to show you the variety of wildlife that use these wetland areas, from turtles and primary cavity excavators such as your pileated up in the upper right, and those cavities will be taken over by wood ducks in following years. And then other species that we might not think about that are in there are your river otters. As I said, capturing fish. I've seen mink working the shorelines, and also beavers. You know, if you have good wetlands and in an area, oftentimes beavers will build their dens up into the banks and not even build a dam, and they'll use the wetland. So it's just, you know, kind of finally touching on some of the human benefits that are out there with all of this on our state lands is outreach and education sites. You know, we can use these to educate school groups and bring the public out there. We've already mentioned a lot about flood abatement and reducing the velocity, but one we didn't mention is erosion control. We want to keep our soils out there on the land. We want to keep the water speeds down. We want to have a good cover on that soil, because that's the basis of everything that we're managing. Recreation, everything from bird watching to hunting to water sports and boating to just your tourism, looking out there, getting out and hiking. And then, as mentioned a little bit, with that sediment settling and the breaking down of materials and capturing those nutrients, we are forming soil in new areas. Quiet places we've touched on, people getting out and the aesthetics. And then the drinking water, if we can help clean up the water, that's going to keep costs down for municipalities and what they need to do to treat our drinking water, and also to help keep our wells safe. And then the financial savings alone, talk about insurance, reducing the destruction to property downstream, and other aspects of stating that. So just some of the slides with outreach. I'm obviously slanted towards waterfowl a little bit, being a migratory game bird person. And when we have wetlands, we also produce waterfowl. We want to monitor those populations. So we ban ducks and geese. And with that, we can bring in children and school groups and hopefully educate them on the values of the wetlands and wildlife species that are out there, and have them think about that in the future as they become bankers and civil engineers and real estate developers. Recreation, we've talked about hunting, you know, whether it's training a dog, getting out with your younger kids in the marsh to hunt, or being out there. As you can see in one of my slides here, we've got hunters on part of the marsh, and we have people out kayaking at the same time. So we have multiple uses. Sometimes they get into conflict a little bit, but most of those are pretty easy to mitigate. The flood abatement, we've touched on that. You can just threw this in as an example of a nice river going through there as it floods out into the floodplain. It's grabbing the sediment, enriching the soils, having the moisture, and then with the grasslands coming on, our grassland birds such as bobolinks and meadowlarks can use these areas. I'm going to increase a little bit here in speed running through these just because I'm looking at the clock, and I know we've kind of got going a little bit late, but I just threw in here, you know, people are always thinking about the economics, and the money always kind of drives this. So with viewing and tourism, hunting and fishing combined, we hire contractors and pay them to work on these sites. We're looking at, as I mentioned, flood abatement, and even property values. A number of people are actually advertising their properties now as having conserved lands near them, because obviously nobody wants any building in their backyard. They'd rather have the privacy, and they have that area to recreate on. And some of the land values have actually gone up. And just some numbers that I have to kind of go along with the viewing and the hunting and fishing aspect of it. I have some, in Vermont, we have about 200,000 from a survey. They did 200,000 resident and non-resident wildlife watchers. We have about 86,000 hunters, both resident and non-resident. Some of the dollar values that I found for hunting, trapping, and angling as the value added from 2006 to 2017, and we adjusted that for inflation, obviously. But back in 2006, that was $79 million in a small state like ours, and it adjusted for 2017 was around $236 million. So that's a big chunk of change for a lot of rural areas, and it helps them economically. From the wildlife viewers aspects of it, it was $17 million back in 2006 and $146 million in 2017. Surprised me it wasn't more with the recreation that's out there, but you know, different values of your toys that are purchased, I think, affect that. And I was just going to go over a few of the locations that the EPA grant has worked on to date. This is Rock River up in Highgate area. The area in tan is a wildlife management area that exists, and the area outlined in red is one that we purchased. You can see the fields that are there. These fields were row cropped, used for hay, manure spread on them, and they also grazed up into the woodlands with their cattle at different times. You can see the dark line, if you can see my cursor right there on the kind of northern part of the new parcel, that's the edge of the wetland. So we're going to be allowing the forest to grow back out into these areas and actually have contracted out for an individual to go in there and treat exotic plants so we can take and set those back and allow the natural vegetation to come into the site. And as you know, the Rock River is pretty high on nutrients, and where we are at this location is right next to Missisquoi Bay, and we all hear about blue-green algae outbreaks on the bay. Another one down is the Innervale WMA and the Fitzgerald parcel that was purchased. On the left-hand side, it outlines the parcel. It is a combination of dairy farming with pasture land right next to the rivers, hay crops alternating with row crops, and is frequently flooded. On the map on the right-hand side, those tan areas are areas that are protected by Vermont Land Trust, and the blue areas are a combination of both state wildlife areas already and lands such as the Winooski Valley Park Authority. And here's a picture of why the farmer realized that it's probably time, besides economic reasons, to move on. He was getting flooded more often. The river is always jumping the banks and scouring out his field trail. And on this site, we're going to institute some ditch plugs, creating some shallow not impoundments, but shallow depressions. And then this entire floodplain is going to be brought back into a forested condition. Another one that's next to it that we're just about ready to close on is what we call the Cenosac Property, another 142 acres. And you can see the number of wet areas on there, and there's it's lined with ditches that we have ideas of putting ditch plugs in and reestablishing forest on these areas. With every parcel, there's always a little bit of, they're never quite the same and never straightforward. This individual that was selling to us just planted down a hay crop. He's going to be allowed to hay a couple of those fields for the next 3 to 4 years, which is also going to give us time to do the restoration work on the other portion. And then once our license is up, we'll convert those fields into forest land and habitat within the area. Dead Creek is another example down on an Addison area. The map on the left kind of shows you the existing Dead Creek property that's shaded in green. We're off kind of in that southwest corner of that little parcel. And then off to your right here is a piece of land that is adjacent to the WMA. We're looking at putting out about 5 or 6 wetlands that we're going to be restoring on this site, reestablishing vegetation on it. And on this one, we worked with Vermont Land Trust because they already had a conservation easement to maintain agriculture on this. They had to give up that easement and allow us to go back into non-ag use. So they're very good to work with on that case. And I just wanted to make sure I mentioned the majority of our partners, Natural Resource Conservation Service, is working with us on restoring lands and helping us acquire them. Lake Champlain Basin Program, BEC as one of our partner or sister agencies or departments, I should say, DU and Nature Conservancy. And there's a number of more that I could put on here, but I just ran out of space. We work with anybody that's interested in working with us on that. And then with that, I see we're getting 10 minutes left into the period. I just throw it out there to questions that people may have.
Awesome. Thank you, David. That was a wonderful presentation. It's so exciting to see so much land being conserved. We do have some questions coming in the chat. We have a question about how do you balance increased human impact with the protection of wildlife?
Well, there's a number of studies that are going on with that because it's becoming more of a problem. We've seen it historically. If you look at a lot of our national parks, they've done studies because they're so intensively used, and we're kind of reaching that point where as the human population grows, there's obviously going to be more pressure on the public lands, and we're really going to have to start evaluating what we do at this point. In some of our areas, we limit access. We have refuge areas where nobody's allowed to go into. You can't go in there bird watching. You can't go in there to hunt. You're not allowed to boat in there. That may, come to be in the future. If you look at places such as the Grand Canyon, they only allow so many people to go down certain trails on certain days. I'd hate to get to that point, and I think it's down the road quite a ways, but it's going to be a tough one because you want people to enjoy nature. You want them to appreciate nature, but you also you've got to understand that no matter what we do, even if we're just walking and hiking out there, we're having that impact on them with disturbance. So yeah, it's not going to be an easy question, and I don't have a good answer yet.
Thank you. We have a question about, so at Lake St. Catherine, they're hoping to be awarded a Lake Champlain Basin Program Watershed Action Plan. This presentation reminds them of the importance of wetlands. Does your office offer evaluation or assessments to elevate the importance of wetlands?
To elevate the importance of wetlands. So they have existing wetlands is what it sounds like, and they want to have it evaluated? Yes. Okay. I know both our department, our ecologists, go out in certain focus areas and will, give you a natural communities evaluation. We have people that are willing to work with towns and such as Jens Heike, working with local planning and conservation commissions that can help them plan on a broader scale. And I know our counterparts in DEC in our wetlands section are out there, and they're evaluating wetlands, as we talked about, for class 1s, class 2s, et cetera, and can help with that. And I know we have personnel that do rapid assessments on that within DEC, but so we could get them information if they want us to get out there, but it may not happen in the same time frame as they want because of the demands on staff.
Great, thank you. We have another question about what types of lands are the Fish and Wildlife Department prioritizing for acquisition now? And if partners find potentially suitable lands, who should they contact?
Okay. We're focusing on, within this grant, is wetland restoration areas. A lot of our focus is on the Winooski River and Otter Creek system. If they find suitable lands or have people that are interested, they can either contact me or send something into we have a website with a public email site that they can send a question to, and the person that looks at that every day will distribute it to the individual within the department that is interested in that. And just as a starting point, if you can't get through to one of us quickly, there's your local conservation districts will be able to help you get directed there. You can talk to our wetlands department, but I would go with that to start. Let's put it that way. Sorry.
No, you're good. Thanks. We have another question. Thanks for the presentation. You mentioned the values of intact wetlands in mitigating damage to downstream communities and infrastructure. Do you have data on the economic impact?
There are studies out there. I didn't grab any, and I think we could look that up. And I saw Julie Folensby was on here, and she may be able to pipe in because she's looked at that before. We'd have to go back and look at that. I mean, just some casual observations. If you look at the damage that was done from the, Irene in 2011, I saw reports of what they had estimated that it helped these floodplains and wetland restorations helped with protecting streams that were down, or towns that were downstream from Brandon Swamp. But even thinking further back, as I was traveling back across the country, I think it was about the early 90s, you had those flood events down in the Missouri River Basin and Mississippi River. I came across the country that time. You could see the destruction of the farmlands and the farmsteads and towns along those areas. I know they have done reports, but I think they said some of the flooding costs are in the billions, and just some of the recent floods that we hear about in the news in the last week or so. So annually, it's quite extensive. I think we could find that.
Thank you. I actually have a question. So with climate change coming, are you guys looking to acquire land that could potentially become wetlands in the future?
We're looking at that, how we think climate change is going to affect wildlife and the habitats they depend on. As you know, we can all see from the predictions from from the scientists that are out there at a much higher level than I am with looking at the weather. We're having higher, storm events. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. It's not necessarily going to be future wetlands. It could be drought conditions that we're dealing with. Look at the tornadoes that are moving further east. So we're not exactly sure, but we're looking at what we think would happen to the wildlife. And I don't see us trying to create wetlands in upland areas. I think we right now what we're looking at is obviously maintaining good habitats that can withstand those storms that are going to be coming at us. So, managing our forest operations in the proper way so that we don't have a storm come through and, give us a landslide afterwards, because of an improper forest activity, or, helping the various departments are going to help maybe towns plan for the proper size of culvert or how to reinforce the roads properly. There's lots of things that are in the works, but I'm not privy to all of them.
Thank you. That's all the questions we have in the chat. I'd like to offer to anyone in the attendees that would like to maybe ask their question out loud to raise your hand if you'd like. Otherwise, we can end a little early and enjoy the snow, I guess.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you, David. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you for answering all of our questions, and thank you everybody for attending. We do have a attendee survey, that if people would be willing to give us some feedback, that would be wonderful. I will post it in the chat once my computer catches up. And thank you, everyone.